10 beaver pelts, prime and heavy, hit the worn pine counter with a soft, final thud. They were a winter's worth of work, of ice and solitude, and they represented the entirety of Silas's worldly wealth. The man who'd put them there was tall and weathered, with eyes the color of a faded sky that had seen too much dust and not enough rain. He was known in Redemption Gulch, Nevada, not by his name, but by the Colt revolver that sat low and easy on his hip, a tool he used with quiet, unnerving efficiency. But it wasn't the gun he was offering. It was the furs. 10 pelts, he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to forming words in a place like this. For the night. The place was a laundry, the only one in town run with any care. It smelled of lye soap, hot water, and something clean and floral he couldn't name. It was a world away from the saloons and stables he usually inhabited, and the woman behind the counter was from a world away too. Her name was Leanne, though most folks in town just called her the Chinaman's widow. She stood amidst the steam and the neat stacks of folded linens, a small, still point in the busy heat of the July afternoon. She wore a simple dress of gray silk, high at the collar and fitted to her form, its austerity a stark contrast to the calico and gingham favored by the other women in town. Her hair was a knot of polished black stone at the nape of her neck, and her hands, though chapped from the harsh soap, moved with a delicate precision as she finished folding a man's shirt. She didn't startle at his crude offer. She didn't gasp or call for help. She simply finished her fold, placed the shirt on a stack, and then lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were dark and deep, and for a moment Silas felt like he was the one being appraised, not the other way around. The town held its breath outside the open door. He could feel their stares, hungry for the explosion they all expected from a man like him. They knew his reputation. They expected him to take what he wanted. But he hadn't. He had offered to pay, and the price was everything he had. Leanne looked from his face to the pile of rich, dark fur. She could have sold them for enough money to buy passage back to whatever home she'd left behind, or to secure her little business for a year. Instead, she slid one pelt from the stack, testing its weight and softness with her fingertips. "This is a fine pelt," she said, her voice soft but clear, without a tremor. "Too fine for what you ask." Silas's jaw tightened. He'd expected rejection, even outrage, but not this calm dismissal. It was as if he were a customer haggling over the price of starching a collar. "It's what I have," he stated, the words clipped. She pushed the single pelt back toward him. "Your price is too high, and my price is not this." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "But you look like a man who has not had a proper meal in a long time. I will cook for you. One hot meal. The price is 1 pelt." The air in the room shifted. Silas stared at her, utterly confounded. Outside, the whispers would be starting, the story twisting into something unrecognizable. The gunslinger and the Chinese widow. He had come in looking for a moment's oblivion, a brief respite from the crushing loneliness that was his constant companion. He had tried to buy it the only way he knew how, with the spoils of a hard and violent life. And she had offered him supper. He looked past her, at the small, clean room behind the laundry, where a simple table was set for one. He thought of the cold jerky and stale biscuits that awaited him at his camp outside of town. He thought of the silence, broken only by the coyotes.
"All right," he heard himself say, the words sounding foreign in his own ears. He pushed the single pelt she had indicated across the counter. "A meal." She nodded once, a gesture of finality, and turned away to a small stove in the corner, leaving Silas standing there with 9 beaver pelts and a profound sense of dislocation. He did not yet know that the simple transaction was the beginning of a debt he could never repay, and a salvation he had never thought to seek. The meal was not elaborate. It was a bowl of rice, steamed vegetables, and thin slices of cooked pork in a savory sauce that tasted of ginger and something else he couldn't identify. But it was hot, and it was real food, served on a clean plate at a scrubbed wooden table. Silas ate with the slow, deliberate movements of a man unaccustomed to such civility. Leanne sat opposite him, not eating, but mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the lamplight as dusk began to settle over the gulch.
The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was a shared quiet, a relief from the noisy expectations of the world outside. He had finished his meal and was staring into the empty bowl when the sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk broke the peace. 3 men darkened the doorway of the laundry. Silas knew their type instantly. They were loud, overconfident, and moved with the clumsy aggression of men who drew their courage from a bottle and each other's company. Their leader was a burly man named Jeb, who worked odd jobs for the town's most powerful man, Mr. Sterling, the owner of the bank, the general store, and the saloon. "Well, well," Jeb drawled, his eyes fixing on Leanne with a greasy smile. "Look what we got here. Seems our little China doll has found herself a protector." His friends snickered behind him. Silas didn't move, but a familiar coldness settled in his gut. His hand twitched, wanting to rest on the worn handle of his Colt. He kept it on the table. Leanne rose slowly, her face a calm, impassive mask. "The laundry is closed for the day, Jeb," she said. "Is it now?" Jeb took a step inside, his boots scraping on the clean floor. "I heard you was offering special services. Thought I might put in a bid myself. I ain't got no beaver pelts, but I got a silver dollar says I'm better company than this drifter." The insult was aimed at Silas, but the threat was for her. It was a public display of power, a reminder of her place in this town. She was vulnerable, an outsider, and they were here to make sure she never forgot it. "You should go," Silas said, his voice low and flat. It was not a request. Jeb's eyes swung to him, a flicker of uncertainty warring with his bravado. He knew who Silas was. Everyone did. But there were 3 of them, and Silas was sitting at a table, looking for all the world like a man who'd been tamed. "This ain't your business, gunslinger," Jeb sneered, gaining confidence. He took another step, reaching a hand out as if to touch a stack of folded laundry. "Mr. Sterling's been saying this part of town's getting a little crowded. Maybe it's time for some folks to move on." That was it. This wasn't just drunken foolishness. This was a message, delivered on behalf of the man who owned the town. Silas began to rise, the scraping of his chair a harsh sound in the tense room. He knew what would happen next. It would be loud, messy, and it would end with blood on the clean floor. It would confirm everything everyone in town already believed about him. He was a creature of violence, and violence was all he had to offer. But before he was fully on his feet, Leanne spoke again. Her voice cut through the tension, not with fear, but with the crisp authority of a banker calling in a loan. "Jebediah," she said, and the use of his full name made the big man flinch. "You still owe my husband's estate for the repair of your wagon wheel last spring. $2.50. She turned her gaze to the second man. "And Walter, your wife's last 3 laundry payments are overdue. She paid me a visit just yesterday, worried you'd drunk the money away again." She looked at the third man, who was already starting to look pale. "And you, Timothy, your mother would be very ashamed to see you here. I have her Sunday dress ready for collection. It would be a pity if something were to happen to it." The 3 men stared at her, their drunken bravado evaporating like spilled whiskey on a hot stone. She hadn't threatened them with a gun or a protector. She had wielded their own lives against them, their debts, their wives, their mothers. She had exposed them, not as fearsome thugs, but as small men with small, messy lives, all of which she knew in intimate detail. The power in the room had shifted completely. Jeb's face was a mottled red. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find a response. Defeated, he turned and stomped out of the laundry, his friends scrambling after him like chastened dogs. Silas slowly sank back into his chair. He looked at Leanne, who was already calmly returning to her mending, her hands as steady as they had been before. He had been ready to solve the problem with death. She had solved it with memory. A moment later, a different figure appeared in the doorway. This was Mr. Sterling, a man whose expensive suit and polished boots looked out of place in the dusty street. He was smiling, a thin, predatory expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. "An impressive display, madam," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oiled leather.
He nodded at Silas. "And remarkable restraint from you, sir. I do appreciate a man who knows when not to cause a fuss." He stepped inside, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. "I merely came to remind you, Mrs. Chen," he said, his eyes on Leanne, "that the lease on this property is due for renewal at the end of the month. I trust you'll have the payment in order. It would be a shame to have to repurpose such a valuable piece of land." He gave them both another thin smile, then turned and walked away, leaving a chill in the summer air. The immediate danger had passed, but Silas knew they had just seen the real threat. Jeb and his friends were just the teeth. Sterling was the jaw. He looked at Leanne, but she was just a woman with a needle and thread. He did not yet know that the paper Sterling held over her was a lie, built on a debt that was never owed. Later that night, long after the town had settled into a nervous quiet, Silas returned to the laundry. The 9 remaining pelts were slung over his shoulder. He hadn't planned to come back, but the thought of his lonely campfire was less appealing than ever. He found Leanne sweeping the floor, her movements methodical, erasing any trace of the earlier confrontation. "They'll be back," Silas said from the doorway. Leanne didn't look up from her work. "I know." "Sterling wants this place." "I know that too." She finally stopped sweeping and looked at him. "Why did you come back?" Silas shifted the weight of the furs on his shoulder. He felt awkward, out of place. He wasn't a man who explained himself. His actions were his language. But tonight, that language felt inadequate. "The meal," he said, the words sounding rough. "It was good." He paused, searching for more words. "I made that offer earlier. The one with the pelts. It wasn't right. Men like me, we get accustomed to the silence. Sometimes it gets so loud you'll do anything to make it stop for a night." He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred. "I figured you for someone who might understand the silence." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Leanne's eyes. She leaned the broom against the wall and gestured for him to come into the back room. She lit another lamp, chasing the shadows into the corners. The small room felt like a sanctuary. "My husband, Way," she began, her voice soft. "He was a scholar, a poet. He saw beauty in the arrangement of words on a page. He was not a man for this country. He did not understand the hunger in men like Sterling." She walked to a small locked chest in the corner and opened it. From inside she removed a thick, leather-bound ledger. She laid it on the table between them. "Way was also a meticulous man," she said, opening the book. The pages were filled with columns of elegant, flowing characters, a script Silas couldn't read, but interspersed were names he recognized: Jeb, Walter, Sterling, and columns of numbers. He kept a record of every transaction, not just the laundry, but loans he made, supplies he sold on credit. He was a fair man, too fair. Her finger traced a line next to Sterling's name. "Mr. Sterling did not lease this land to my husband. My husband bought it. He paid in full with money he brought from our home. But the deed was filed by Mr. Sterling, who was the territorial agent at the time. Way trusted him." She turned a page. "Sterling borrowed money from my husband for a mining venture that went sour. It is all here, the dates, the amounts. The debt is his, not mine." "Then show this to the marshal," Silas said, leaning forward, the raw injustice of it stirring something in him. Leanne shook her head, a sad, weary gesture. "The marshal is Sterling's friend. He eats at Sterling's table. He would see only a book of strange markings written by a dead Chinaman." She looked at Silas, her composure finally cracking, revealing the deep well of fear and exhaustion beneath. "Way died 6 months ago. An accident in one of Sterling's mines. A support beam collapsed. They said he was prospecting." "He was a scholar," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. "Not a prospector." "He went to the mine to demand repayment from Sterling," she whispered. "He took this ledger with him to prove the debt. He never came back. They returned the ledger to me, saying it was all they found. They did not know what it contained." The physical object on the table was no longer just a book. It was a testament, a weapon, and the only thing standing between Leanne and ruin. It was the reason her husband was dead, and it was the reason Sterling would not stop until he had it, or her, gone. The smell of smoke reached them first, acrid and sharp. Then a faint orange glow flickered against the window. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his hand finally going to his Colt. He moved to the front of the laundry, peering through the glass. At the back of the building, near the woodpile, flames were licking up the dry, clapboard wall. "They're trying to burn you out," he said, his voice grim. Panic flared in Leanne's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. She didn't run for the door. She ran back to the table. "The ledger," she said, her voice tight with desperation. The fire was catching fast, the dry wood of the old building crackling hungrily. Smoke was already beginning to seep under the door from the main room. They had moments. Silas looked from Leanne, clutching the heavy book to her chest, to the pile of furs he'd dropped by the door. His entire future, the freedom to ride away and start again somewhere else, was sitting in that pile.
It was his past and his future, all tied up in 10 dead animals. He could grab them and be out the door in seconds. He owed this woman nothing more than a thank you for a hot meal. But as he looked at her, standing there with her husband's legacy in her arms, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes defiant, he knew he couldn't leave her. That old familiar silence he'd been running from would be 1,000 times louder if he did. "Give it to me," he ordered, his voice sharp with command. "Go out the front, get clear of the building. I'll be right behind you." She hesitated, unwilling to part with the book. "Go, now!" he roared, and the authority in his voice finally made her move. She ran for the door, stumbling out into the night air. Silas grabbed the ledger. The smoke was thicker now, stinging his eyes. He could hear the roar of the flames from the back wall. He turned to follow her, but his eyes snagged on the pelts. With a curse, he lunged for them, managing to grab the leather thong that bound them together. He dragged the heavy bundle toward the door, but a section of the burning ceiling collapsed, showering sparks and flaming debris between him and the exit. He recoiled, the heat searing his face. He had a choice, and only a second to make it. The ledger or the furs, his old life or a chance at a new one. He let go of the leather thong. The pelts, a winter of brutal work, lay abandoned on the floor. Clutching the heavy ledger, he found another way out, a small storage room window at the side of the building. He kicked it open, threw the book out onto the dusty ground, and hauled himself through the opening, just as the main roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of fire and embers into the night sky. He landed hard, coughing, his lungs burning. Leanne was there, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her home and her livelihood turn to ash. He pushed the ledger into her hands. Their eyes met over the book, the roar of the fire filling the space between them. He had lost everything he owned, but as he looked at her, safe, the book secure in her grasp, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had made the right choice. 6 months later, the smell of wood smoke in Redemption Gulch was different. It was the comforting scent of a cook stove, not the acrid stench of destruction. Where the old laundry had stood, a new one now rose, built of fresh-cut pine, its windows larger, letting in the pale winter sun. A small, sturdy room had been built onto the side. It was Silas's room. He no longer worked the trap lines. The fire had taken 8 of his 10 pelts. With the money from the 2 he'd managed to salvage, he had bought a sturdy freight wagon and 2 mules. He was no longer the town's nameless gunslinger. He was Silas, the freighter. He hauled supplies from the railhead in Carson City, bringing in goods for Leanne's laundry and for the few other shopkeepers not under Sterling's thumb. The work was honest, his hands now calloused from leather reins instead of a gun's handle. The ledger had changed everything. The day after the fire, Silas had ridden with Leanne to the territorial marshal's office, not in town, but the circuit marshal 50 miles north. With Silas standing as a witness, a man whose word, backed by his reputation, carried an undeniable weight, Leanne presented the book. The evidence was irrefutable. Sterling's carefully constructed empire of debt and intimidation crumbled. Faced with federal charges of fraud and a quiet investigation into Wei Chen's accident, he sold his holdings for pennies on the dollar and disappeared overnight. The town, free from his shadow, began to breathe again. And in that new air, they saw Leanne not as a helpless outsider, but as the woman who had quietly stood her ground and won. Today, the laundry was closed. Silas stood before the small mirror in his room, fumbling with the collar of a clean shirt Leanne had made for him. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. It felt strange, like he was missing a part of himself. But the feeling was one of lightness, not vulnerability. He walked into the main room where Leanne was waiting. She was not wearing her customary gray silk. Today, she wore a simple dress the color of a spring sky, and her hair was down, falling in a dark wave over her shoulders. She held a small bundle of dried wildflowers. They walked together, side by side, down the main street of Redemption Gulch. People nodded to them, no longer with suspicion, but with a quiet respect. They walked into the small clapboard church at the end of the street, where the circuit preacher waited. The ceremony was short and simple. There were no guests, just the two of them and the preacher, whose words echoed in the empty building. When it was time, Silas took Leanne's hand.
It felt small and strong in his. He thought of the first time he had walked into her laundry, a man hollowed out by loneliness, offering a fortune in furs for a moment of forgetfulness. He had been so sure of what he needed, and so utterly wrong. He had offered 10 pelts for one night. In return, she had given him a hot meal, a reason to stay, and a reason to be a better man than the one he had been. She had given him a home. As the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had made the best trade of his life. A man could spend a lifetime chasing a fortune in the wild, only to find that the only thing of any real value was a quiet place to lay his head, beside someone who understood the silence. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.